This way. Is that Prince for King? What's today's mathematics?
Truth is universal. Truth cannot be invented.
Then it was guaranteed that Marcus Garvey would come the next night. And the hall was packed with people. And everybody went with ammunition.
How they understand themselves as African, right, and American.
Yes.
Like, it's not either or, right?
Everybody who knows anything about Israel knows that in order to effectuate significant change, you not only need a majority, you need a Jewish majority.
America awards her killers, and they get ribbons and stripes and bars.
A U.S. State Department sponsored program and set of musical tours called the Jazz Ambassadors.
Talks about the work of Marcus Garvey and the work of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad as being demonstrative of, and he basically called them total nationalists.
But the reality is that African people are not vicious, violent people.
He's not teaching hate, he's teaching history.
Peace. Welcome to a very, very special edition of Wazadon TV in conjunction with Iansá Magazine. If you're not up on Iansá Magazine, you definitely need to be. Link is in the description. Great articles, great content. And today we have a very, very special guest. We have a Grammy-winning songwriter and reggae musician who's worked with some of the likes of Kabaka Pyramid, Lucky Day, Chronics, MediSun. Thank you for coming through.
Thank you so much, Brother Rakeem. It's a joy to be here. Appreciate the invite,
Absolutely, absolutely. We appreciate, again, we appreciate the time. We also appreciate the music. We appreciate your contribution to the art. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to get into some of it now. First, though, anytime somebody comes on the show first, I would like to ask them, what was it that, radicalized you as far as, having a Pan-African, point of view and worldview?
Well, I would say it's a couple of things. The first one is essentially growing up Black in America, obviously. I mean,
yeah,
as Baldwin stated, to be Black in this country is to be in almost a perpetual state of rage. So there's that. And then having my Caribbean foundation and roots, also growing up in a situation where, so my father was a bishop. So I grew up basically in the church until they removed me from the church because there was something in the way that we were practicing our spiritual tradition as a people that, obviously there are many cultural retentions that only survive because of the existence of that space. But it's like through what I was witnessing, I'm talking about at 5, 6, 7 years old before I had any concrete knowledge of our history. I'm looking at what we're doing versus the veneer that's been placed over it, and that every woman's hair has to be pressed out and you have to wear these suits and all of this kind of European aesthetic. This is a Pentecostal church, so people are rolling over, speaking in tongues, there's oil flying everywhere. And I could feel the ancestral practice moving through the space. And it just became clear that this is a derivative of something, but I need to dive deeper. And as I asked those pertinent questions, that there was a sort of chasm that opened up to where some of the relationships with some of my elders have never fully recovered because I chose Rastafari way, which then opened up the route to the Bantu cosmology and cosmogony and to Nile Valley civilization and to our true story as a people. So I think those are two really key experiences that shaped my thinking.
Absolutely. I think, a lot of us go through that, especially with family and friends, when we begin to study for ourselves and, break away from the church. Not dissing the Black church. Obviously, the Black church has played a pivotal role in many movements, in America and the Caribbean and things of that nature. But as we begin to search and study more, sometimes obviously we begin to find something, quote unquote, more ancestral, right? Like, so whenever you decided to, or whenever in your own journey, was that can you just talk about how you navigated that, and because we know that it can put strain on certain relationships sometimes, and it's not a point in hurting anyone's feelings or letting anybody down. This is our own self-determination. You know what I mean? This is our own journey and our own path. Can you talk about how you navigated your path as a youth, and how you, I guess, reacted to some of those relationships that you mentioned being fractured somewhat?
Well, I would say that I think every individual that goes through a sort of spiritual awakening has a particular experience that we all can relate to, because the initial again, the rage, because you realize, wait, so I've been lied to by every institution around me all this time, whether it's, my elders who knew no better in the public school system. My education didn't begin until I left school. There's so, our medical establishments, that everything around me has basically been set out to not only destroy me, but we can look into, of course, Tuskegee and the history of them using these institutions to experiment on, exploit, and destroy us. So the initial phase is wrath. You just want to burn down everything.
Facts.
There comes a point. In the beginning, it's like I really don't care. I was very, very militant. In my early unfolding into awareness, and then it's like, when you realize how deep the trauma is, when you realize not only we as melanated people, but the entire world is really been hypnotized into this delusion, this hallucination. It takes some of the us versus them false dichotomy off of the table, and it becomes an issue of consciousness, that somebody who resembles you can be just as much of an op as someone who doesn't, you know what I mean? And then, I think with maturity, there's more and more of an understanding about what to prioritize in terms of that self-determination, self-development, and it becomes less of a battle against, I guess, as they would say even in the book, flesh and blood, and more so about principalities and powers. It becomes a spiritual warfare.
Absolutely. You mentioned also in that spiritual journey that it led you to different Bantu spiritual concepts, and also Nile Valley spiritual concepts. Can you, for those who may be, new and just entering these spaces, can you talk about that some?
Well, when you look into the Abrahamic faith, the first thing that, that creates a sort of dissonance between what we were taught generally growing up versus the more traditional systems of pretty much every indigenous culture on the planet is the concept of monotheism versus polytheism, which is again a false dichotomy, because there is no African spiritual system in which there's more than one God. That's a common misconception. There are many manifestations, but when I was looking into when and where and why did we move away from the system of having many representations of the Almighty into forcing the one, then of course we get into to Akhenaten, and get into the wanting to create a monolith and outlaw the other priesthoods to concentrate the consciousness of the people into the hands of one, which of course happens to be the person who's trying to force this change. So once I realized that, and I began to look also at the fact that they can overlay in terms of the nature of the Neteru, as we're talking about nature, the various deities, and then you look at the Orisha of Yoruba land, you look at the Vodun, you look at even the Congo cosmology, and I would say the person who really opened my eyes to that cosmology is Dr. Kimbwandende Fukiao, who was teaching here in Massachusetts, I think right over the bridge in Cambridge.
Wow.
Unfortunately, I didn't find out about him until he had already left the physical plane. I would have went and looked for him.
Right.
But yeah,
he's the one that wrote the Bantu cosmology, right?
Indeed. So that was very eye-opening for me. There are other teachers like Dr. Marimba Ani Yorugu, and these stories and these legends, they overlap in such a way that it's like, okay, you begin to realize the difference in how we dealt with spirit is we use allegory and we use imagery to communicate about principles and about energies that exist, versus trying to force a history to say that this is it, this is the only. Because even within one faith, you know, within the Kemetic tradition, there's about 8 different creation stories.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's what I found really refreshing and really it reveals the approach, sort of reveals what the agenda is.
Yeah.
Whereas our spirituality is more about unlocking your own personal power and creating a balance with the other forces of creation. These other belief systems are basically saying, this is it. Either you fall under this or you need to be wiped out.
Right. Absolutely. It's a God that is jealous, that is vengeful, and that, you know what I mean? And you can kind of see that in it spills down, the ideology spills down to the congregation, right? And they begin to take on the characteristics of the God that they worship.
So we see what's happening in the Western world currently, and it all is very much in alignment.
Actual facts. Yeah, we see it even like with this big thing with, I know you see it all the time, like in the news, with this big push for white Christian nationalism and like a God who, you know, according to them, you know, favors one group over another, right? And they are the chosen group, you know what I mean? And we see how they begin to adopt, you know, or begin to, I guess, it's twofold. They begin on to take the characteristics of their God, and then they give their God their characteristics, right? And it's such a, it's such a,
yeah. Man creates the Most High in its own image, for sure, versus the alternative. And that idea, as you said, of sort of the myth of the white Christian utopia. It's a really interesting thing being here, and you know, Boston is a pretty liberal city, you know, which, you know, liberal is another versus conservative is a whole other debate. I don't know which side is more dangerous, to be honest.
Right.
People are very well educated here in terms of academia, so most people don't buy into, you know, that false idea that there was ever a prosperous West that was not predicated on the enslavement, genocide, and the dispossession of other nations. At the same time, this is another divide and rule tactic, in the sense that what we really are witnessing is late stage capitalism. Of course, the system, the monopoly game is almost up. Everything's been claimed, and you know, the squeeze on those who are not in that very top, you know, 1%, is just getting tighter and tighter. It's getting harder and harder to live an existence that's anything less. I call it subscription based. You know, for anyone to be able to own anything, they're trying to get rid of that as much as possible to keep you on an eternal hamster wheel. And a lot of the white population of this country, as they've done in the past, instead of looking at the way that the robber barons of this era are dispossessing them, they are directing their attention and saying, well, it must be these immigrants, it must be these black and brown people, because they're not going to punch up.
Right. Yeah. We see that a lot, because, you know, with this whole thing, as you know, what's happening with ICE and all over the country, people who are supporters of ICE and the status quo, they're quick to blame, you know, they'll use the immigrants are taking our jobs and these type of things, but they never blame the capitalists for exploiting their labor and choosing to have cheap labor over, you know, paying you a livable wage. They never, like you mentioned, they never punch up. They always punch down.
It's looking like Tulsa all over again.
Man, you ain't lying. Yep. You know, being a Grammy award-winning artist. Very few people obviously can say that. Where did the musical journey begin with you?
Well, just to clarify, I'm a Grammy certified songwriter. I haven't won for my artistry as yet, but I'm a Grammy certified songwriter. And where my musical journey begins is an ancestral journey. It's I'm actually the custodian of a long-standing tradition. You know, my father was a recording artist by the name of Supreme, out of the island of Montserrat. You know, you can YouTube him, and he's still out there. He has a song named Sensational. If you type in Supreme Sensational, you know that my father was a calypso musician. If you know anything about calypso has a lot in common with hip hop, in that, you know, my dad tells me that when he was kids, and his uncles as well, the generation before him, like my grandmother and all of them, they're all musicians, play, sing, recording artists. And so they trained him, and basically you would have to be able to make up, you know, you would have basically battles where you would have to make up lyrics on the spot, and whoever ran out of lyrics first loses. So on that storytelling aspect of how I approach music derives largely from that. And then my dad's uncle who trained him, he's known as Reality, Everton Weeks, is responsible for one of the biggest hits that the Caribbean has ever given to the world. Ole, 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 me heart on fire, me soul on fire, feeling hot, hot, hot.
Wow.
So that is my lineage. And then my brother's also a Grammy nominated producer. My sister works in the industry as well. So it's just coming down the line.
Absolutely, man. That's a hell of a pedigree. When we talk about music, you know, and we look at artists like Nina Simone, who said that an artist's duty is to reflect the times. Caribbean artists have a very unique relationship, to the United States in a way that very much does that. On one hand, I know you saw artist Nicki Minaj, who's Trinidadian, openly praising Donald Trump and trying to manufacture consent for war in Nigeria. Then there are artists such as yourself who we have seen condemn the actions of U.S. imperialism. On a recent Instagram post, you openly condemned the actions of the United States and Venezuela and Nigeria. Where do you think the political divide comes from, where some of our Caribbean brothers and sisters are advocating revolution and others are advocating integration and status quo?
I think one of the texts that really opened my eyes as it relates to this issue is Basil Davidson's The Black Man's Burden, in which he identifies that the biggest obstacle to progress for the African continent, and by extension the diaspora, is the Black bourgeoisie, is many times the, you know, whether it's the academic or the economically empowered sector of our nation, not really wanting good for the rest of the nation. You know, WEB, of course, talked about that talented tenth. And I think to only credit 10% of our population with having, you know, great creative potential is absolutely elitist, like by default. And I think that there's also a bit of a Stockholm syndrome going on, where people think that if you lick the right boots, that, you know, you'll be on the safe side when they decide to do whatever they're trying to do. Which historically, how did that work out? How did that work out for Toussaint?
Right.
How did that work out for trying to, you know, coexist with people who've proven themselves time and time again to be interested in only their own well-being?
Yeah, I agree. Another one is Black Bourgeoisie from E. Franklin Frazier. I would suggest people read as well. Speaking of Venezuela and Nigeria, and then we see, you know, America attempting to take Greenland, which is also colonized from Denmark. Like, with all of this stuff going on in the news, whenever you just have a moment to yourself, sit back and reflect on it, like what are your thoughts on today's like political climate?
What I find so interesting about us as a species is how amnesiac we are, and how at this point it feels like they're not even really trying to mask their intentions. It's very, very basic. It's like maybe a little bit of smoke. They're not even using mirrors anymore because positioning, positioning themselves as liberators, as and then again, as you touched on earlier, galvanizing the Christian white majority that's put this regime in office to say, well, they're hurting Christians in Nigeria, so that's why we need to go and take over their oil. Like it's very, very transparent. And as a global citizen, my very first time going on tour was in 2009, and that was in Beirut, Lebanon. And I've gotten to travel a lot of the world since then. And from what I experienced, people love American music and culture and certain things, but in terms of our global geopolitics, nobody respects America or takes America seriously at this point.
Right. As they shouldn't. America has shown itself to be the imperialist nation that everybody, thinks it is, and now things are so overt and out in the open. They're not even trying to hide anything anymore. A lot of times they would do things under the guise of some type of humanitarian effort. But now it's just like,
right,
hey, we want it, we're going to take it.
As we would say in Jamaica, brawling badness. Badness is literal gangsterism on the global scale. And like you said, in the past, you think of like the Gulf of Tonkin, false flag incidents, whatever they would have to use as a pretext to make certain moves. At this point, this man is telling you straight up, like I've seen clips from the last UN gathering, and this man is basically standing up in front of the world telling them, look, we have the biggest military, we have the biggest, like, who can talk to me?
Right. Yep. And that's the thing. I read the other day that America, I think the number was 859 billion, how much they spend on their military, which is more than they're in the number one in the top 10. The bottom 9 is more than them combined, right? And it's like, obviously we see that's where America's power is. They know that they can get away with all of these things because of their military prowess.
Might will never make right. And generations will have to pay whatever they think they're getting away with today. There will be universal balance.
Absolutely. I don't think people are ready to reckon with that. You know what I mean? But it's the absolute truth. Going back to the music, Roll Some Mo. I didn't know Can you tell me your involvement on that? Because if people don't know, that's a joint with Lucky Day and Chronics. It's the remix. Man, I had that remix on so many different playlists, man. That was my joint. Can you talk about your involvement in Roll Some Mo? And if you haven't heard it, guys, you can. It's on Lucky Day's deluxe album. I forgot the name of the album, but it's a yellow album.
I think I have it somewhere. The vinyl, but yeah. Roll Some More. So what's interesting about that record, firstly, is that it actually released a month into the COVID era. So it's not a record that we ever really got to give the full strength or push or perform, but it was a groundbreaking moment for me. And at the time, my sister was actually working with both Lucky Day and the producer D Mile, who, if people don't realize, the person who produced that record is also the producer on those songs for Bruno Mars and Silk Sonic, I'm Gonna Leave the Door Open, all of that. So at the time, I had been working within the camp, doing writing for other artists and doing different things. Obviously, the original Roll Some More was taking off. It was already hot, and they're just like, the producer's actually, he's Haitian. He's from Brooklyn. So he grew up around the reggae culture, and he just decided he wanted to do a reggae remix. And seeing as I'm in the camp already, there's like, yo, we have a reggae artist in the camp. Yeah, man, so Medi, for sure. So I put that verse there, which is the last verse on the song, and they're saying, yo, we should get another artist who is going to make sure that this song kind of cracks in the Caribbean market. And they approached a particular artist, and that artist actually declined the opportunity and say, yo, I feel like a cran man on a link, So, got in touch with Chronix, and the rest is history.
That's such a legendary record, man. And yeah, you know, so you mentioned that did, because you're right, that did come out during the pandemic. When the world was shut down, did your approach to music kind of change? Were you, you know, some artists say that they, you know, they were able to kind of just like lock in and because there were obviously less distractions, but it was also a pretty hectic time. People didn't really know what was going to happen. You know, people were getting sick, loved ones dying. Like, how did you manage as far as, you know, writing and recording during the pandemic? Did your approach change? Like, what was that experience like?
Well, I feel as if the entire world, whether or not we were made aware, were being put through a certain type of Pavlovian conditioning to rely on screens and, you know, these devices to interact more. At the same time, you know, we are rebels. So some of the coolest experiences that I had, even there's a major writing camp that took place in 2020 that we did in Jamaica that gave birth to some other records, like more recently released Born in Jamaica with myself, Barris Hammond, and Jesse Royal. And, you know, there's another record. Yeah, there's another record that went out, I think it was 2021, called Never Be the Same, that was made at that same camp. Myself, Kabaka Pyramid, Olu from Earth Gang, Hector.
Oh, yeah, he's dope.
Yeah, Earth Gang's tight, man. They're really, really tough. So there were a lot of really cool, like cool experiences creatively that we were having within the industry, even when there were restrictions. But in terms of my personal approach, there's really no difference. I mean, when I'm channeling vibrations, because I always, when people ask how I approach songwriting, it's like I don't really consider myself a writer per se, but both a conduit and a translator. Like there's sometimes that, because my instrument is guitar, so sometimes I just sit down and I hear something being sent to me from the Almighty, and other times, you know, somebody might send you a beat or send you, you know, music to voice over. And I feel like every composition, the song is already in the composition. You just have to listen well and translate it into something that other people can feel, so that they understand the feeling that you're getting from hearing the song. So that doesn't really change based on whatever they got going on outside.
Absolutely. Did you? So you said that you were in a writing camp with Jesse Royal, Kabaka Pyramid, and Earth Gang.
Earth Gang. A lot of people pulled up. Lucky was around. Chronix pulled up. It was really amazing. And we do.
Yeah, what was that experience like? Because these are, like, including yourself, these are people who are able to write and sing and perform at the highest of levels, and you are all in one spot just being creative. I know the creative energy just had to be like just to the ceiling.
Yeah, big up Friends Only. Friends Only is the name of the collective, and it's like, I don't know if you're into X-Men, or sure you do, you know, like the Danger Room, where it's like everybody, you know, we're all in this scenario, and you're just seeing people pop off. Like, because there's certain people that I only found out about through that camp. You know, one of the people that's an example of that is JID. I didn't really know about it, but from the moment I saw his process and saw him come through as the king that he is and deliver that type of energy, I was just like, okay, brother, I see you, king. And likewise, you know, people, nobody knows who's who. Many times you step into a camp, and I think that's part of what's really powerful, is not only being pushed in terms of your own process, but learning from others and seeing how they do things and exchanging different techniques even. So it's like, I might be of the earth element, someone else is a fire element, and I see something they do and vice versa. And now we're teaching each other different moves and how to unlock different powers. So it's amazing.
Yeah, that's dope. Just like everybody adding new tools to their toolbox. You know what I'm saying? Like, on a more political note, though, I would like to ask you, as we know what's happening in Burkina Faso, and you know, revolution being led by Captain Ibrahim Traore, who, you know, has inspired African people all over the world. In some circles, obviously, he is highly controversial. But you have a song called One General with King Jammy where you're voicing your support for Traore. I wanted to ask you how Rastafari has influenced your understanding of what's currently taking place. And not just that, but what are your thoughts on the General Traore himself?
Well, when we speak of Rastafari, some people think it's just, you know, the title of the religion or the life, you know, the liberty that we have. But, you know, we're dealing with His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I, and His Empress Menen in divine balance, and the example of how he maneuvered as a ruler and also as a general on the battlefield, as well as a diplomat, and how we approached his world affairs, and as the original head also of the African Union. And looking at Traore's, at least this early part of his ascendance into the figure that he is, it obviously everyone knows that it's reminiscent of Sankara. It's reminiscent of Lumumba in many ways. It's reminiscent of many ones who have had that mindset of nationalizing resources, of, you know, really practicing also Marcus Garvey's philosophy in real time.
Yes.
And obviously to the Western world and to other nations who are part of the globalist economy, this is extremely threatening. This is extremely problematic. But I would say, as far as Rastafari is concerned, because again, as Rastafari nation, we are also generally, we are Garveyites, and anything that is empowering to melanated people or to all indigenous people of the world. And I think it's also the manner in which he is speaking truth to power, and he is punching up, and he is unafraid, even for his own life. It's
Right.
It's absolutely an inspiration. So when I stepped in the booth that day, I was at King Jammy's studio in Waterhouse, you know, Firehouse as we call it, in Kingston, and I was there to wrap up a record that was a really big collaboration with one of my favorite artists who actually is not even on this physical plane any longer, you know. But he said he had another rhythm for me, so he put on that rhythm. And at that time, I had been seeing a lot of the smear campaigns. You know, the media was already starting to paint him as, you know, dangerous to the global order. And of course, he's influencing Mali. He's influencing other countries to withdraw from, you know, the French central bank. And, you know, he's, you know, is he a tyrant? Is he this or that? You know, they ask the question, so it doesn't look like an accusation. But I was seeing those conversations, and I said, you know what? Before we allow them to create their narrative, let the lion tell his own story. So that is absolutely what I was doing in that moment, is speaking on behalf of Rastafari Nation, on behalf of Jamaica. We love Ibrahim Traore. We love what he's doing. And I think he's an exemplary leader. When we look at what's happening on the continent right now, we see so many leaders that are more than willing to brutalize and send their own people up the river. You know, I just recently, my most recent time spent in Africa was spent on the island of Zanzibar. I spent some time on the mainland in Dar es Salaam as well, in Tanzania. And just after my departure, you know, I was told that elections were going to take place. So I saw the campaigning going on, but seeing what has taken place since I've departed, you know, it's a perfect example of what we don't need and what is no longer going to be tolerated for this generation of Africans. It's the days of the brutal repression and might ruling over, right? It's over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Africa for the Africans, man. Whenever we, and speaking of like Rastafari, there are obviously a lot of misconceptions, you know. A lot of people may not have heard of, you know, Leonard Howell, or you know, may not have read much Marcus Garvey. but they don't realize or understand the decolonial roots of Rastafari. A lot of times they just see it as what pop culture likes to portray as Rastafari, where it's, peace, love, and ganja, right? Like they try to make it palatable, and they try to make it suitable for.
I like the word marketable. It's like
marketable. Yes. They try to make it marketable, the same way they do Dr. King, right? Like this is what they do. But when we talk about Rastafari and those misconceptions and people not understanding, a lot of people not understanding the decolonial roots of Rastafari, can you talk about that some and the political aspect of it? Because as you mentioned, a lot of people in Rastafari Nation are Garveyites, and Garvey's teachings and philosophy in the UNIA heavily influenced how and not even just going back to Garvey, but Paul Bogle and the insurrections at Morant Bay and all of these different things. Jamaica has such a revolutionary history. Matter of fact, I've been reading, almost done now. I've been reading Gerald Horne's Counter-Revolution of 1776 lately, and he talks a lot about how the settlers in the mainland, how Africans begin to outnumber white settlers, especially in the Carolinas and Virginia, but they always outnumbered white settlers in Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, places like that. And then many of our ancestors from Jamaica, from Barbados, from Antigua began to be shipped out here in the Carolinas, especially. And and he talks about how they put so much fear in the white settlers on a day-to-day basis, things like the Stono Rebellion and all of that. But I'm saying that to say this: I see the genetic link with Rastafari and all of that, right? But a lot of people may miss that. Again, they take what's marketed to them. But can you talk about that some?
Well, first and foremost, to put everything in context, we have to look at the timing of the ascension of Rastafari consciousness, which coincided with sort of the post-Italo-Ethiopian War period, or even during, as Africans in the West and in Jamaica, we were observing what was taking place alongside some other things, the Mau Rebellion and different things in the continent, but specifically the time in which Emperor Haile Selassie was governing Ethiopia, which to this day has never been officially colonized, the only nation in Africa that can say that, as well as his father, Menelik. We were looking at pretty much, it was the status quo of what was happening post-Berlin Conference.
Yeah,
carving up of Africa and these nations feeling like, well, they can decide amongst themselves what they're going to do and what they're not going to do. And the way that Menelik, basically, his approach was much more militaristic. He was able to defeat and push back the Italians more so by physical force, as depicted in the Battle of Adwa. Ethiopia has been victorious on the battlefield. His Imperial Majesty took it to a level of diplomacy. His many speeches, which can be reviewed, his speech before the League of Nations, which was like the precursor to the UN, his visiting with many heads of states, including, Dr. Martin Luther King. Upon his passing, there's a famous picture of him going to pay his respects. He was very active in international, as you said, Black revolutionary movement, and that inspired us greatly, of course, because Marcus Garvey had asked, had basically made that clarion call to say, where's the Black man's king? Where's the Black man's God? Look to the east for the coming of a Black king. So that even further cemented the admiration we had for His Majesty and how he was moving. But as you say, if we go deeper into our history as Jamaicans, there are many things that we can gather from even the etymology of our language or our dialect that points to what specific nations in Africa we descend from. But one of those main nations is the Akan, the Ashanti. And you hear about Tucky's rebellion. You know, there's a man named Tucky who was considered, you know, an Obia man, or a spiritual priest, an African spiritual priest. And you know, he was given the colonial powers fits. You know, not only did he overthrow the ship that tried to bring him and his people in, they then took to the hills, and just like Queen Nani and General Kojo and all of them, they were giving these people, you know, they couldn't sleep at night, as you said. It was very bad. But when you mentioned the moving of people around, especially people who were, I guess, seen as the sources of rebellion, you know, community leaders, there's a book that really opened my eyes to that practice called Enacting Power.
Okay.
And it basically touches on the Obia Act that was instituted in the 1800s. And basically, from the late 18th century, let's say 1760 or so, they began making laws in Jamaica that made practicing African spirituality something that could be punishable by law, that you could be imprisoned for. And that first law that they used was under the category of vagrancy law.
Okay.
Because if you're, you know, basically a babalawo or a priest who's, you know, giving advice or, you know, healing people with herbs or giving people any spiritual information, they would either lock you up, which was usually followed, you know, following a public flogging with the cat of nine tails. But apart from that, imprisonment, hard labor, one of the main punishments that they used if you were a spiritual leader or organizer in the community was called transportation. So if I'm in Boston and I've been identified as someone that, you know, the enslaved people around me are going to for advice and for empowerment, they'll just ship me to Wisconsin.
Right.
Or they might send me like down to Brazil or somewhere, you know, a whole different continent. And, you know, one of the people that this happened to was actually a man by the name of Dutch Bookman.
Yes.
And we all know what Bookman did in Haiti on the night of the revolution. So even in them attempting to punish us inadvertently, they empowered
themselves.
The revolution, yeah. Keep Napoleon's behind. So there is a long lineage there, even predating Rastafari, but with that Garveyite influence and the influence of His Majesty in terms of that image of African sovereignty and African royalty that is going, as I believe His Majesty was it 225th in the line of in the Solomonic line. So it's like it's a very noble lineage, and all of these things in my mind contribute to that one sovereign African consciousness.
Absolutely. That's very, very well said. And I think that's a perfect segue to the next question. The editor-in-chief of Iansá Magazine, Maryam Aziza Muhammad, had a question for you that she wanted to ask. Even though she couldn't conduct the interview herself, she wanted me to ask you this. Iansá is a publication that is directly rooted in Black divinity. The name of the magazine comes from the name of an Orisha based in the Afro-Brazilian religion of Candomblé. But before the EIC even learned about that, the initial influences of said Black divinity came from the Nation of Islam by way of her father and the Rastafari faith by way of her uncle. And one of the things that she wanted to ask or get your opinion on is that, you know, people often get up in arms about the idea of Black gods or religions centered around Black people. The idea of people of African descent having agency over their religion and spirituality is a huge problem for people. You know, we think about Dessalines becoming a Loa in Haitian Voodoo. John Coltrane is a saint in a San Francisco church. Elijah Muhammad said the Black man is God. We think about his imperial majesty. And so with that in mind, she wanted to ask you, what do you think people misunderstand about not just Rastafari, but Black divinity in general?
I wouldn't even say that it's a misunderstanding. I think they understand very well.
Right.
The fear is melanated people on many different planes of activity have access to a certain type of energy that no other nation has access to. And a lot of that access is rooted in our ability to call forth and command certain ancestral powers and abilities that, are rooted in our traditions. You can even look at, for example, this whole genre of films, the zombie movies. What is zombie? What is a zombie?
Right.
A zombie is a human vessel that essentially cannot be killed. It's unstoppable, insatiable, It's just going to keep coming at you. Where did that come from? Well, the first encounter with Nzambi is one of the Bantu words for the Almighty.
Wow.
That is out of the Bakongo tradition. And those who had been armed with certain amulets and certain powers, you can shoot at them, you can stab them, you can do whatever you want. They're going to stop coming.
Right.
And there are certain, there's this theory of cellular memory, that when any experience that we have is handed down to our descendants, whether or not we even communicate it to them. So there's something in their subconscious memory, I think, that they still fear to this day, the way that they were unable to stop or kill or subdue certain African nations, even with all of their bullets and ammunition and weapons. So that becomes, now they sublimate that through this whole zombie genre. And there are so many examples of this where, again, we mentioned Tulsa earlier, where, a bunch of Black people coming together and creating wealth on a scale that other nations outside of America are ready to do business with this nation, within a nation. And so what do? They come in to destroy it or disrupt it. So it's not only just a fear of the cosmology or the theology of the things that we practice. Black people gathering, period, for a productive purpose has always been something that other nations look at with fear. And I'll say, even with Rastafari and certain things, this is a Black liberation theology, but you find many people who are of the line of the thing we're trying to get away from, that do their very best to make sure that they stay in it, There's money, or I'm going. Like, there has to be, it's like there's this fear about, if Black people organize without allowing any other nation in, it's prohibited. But I mean, when the Chinese are doing their, Shenyang or whatever they're doing, nobody can tell them you have to let Black people in.
Right.
When Indians are doing their Bollywood and whatever, nobody can tell them anything. But for some reason, it seems like whenever we gather, there's a general fear. And that fear, to me, is rooted in a concern that if we are like them, which we're not, but if we were like them, then, that fear of retaliation, that fear of, these people are going to organize and it's going to be another Nat Turner.
Right. They have a fear that we're eventually going to do the same thing that they did to us, right? They know what they did to us was one of probably the worst atrocity in the history of humans. But they have this fear that when, like you mentioned, when Black people organize, when we gather, when we begin to mobilize, that the tables will turn, right? And it's so interesting because on one hand, they'll act like what was done to us was not so bad, but they have a fear of us turning the tables, right? And it's so paradoxical in some ways, but I think that's part of the pathology of white supremacy.
And I wanted to touch on something else, because aside in the title of this reasoning, even when you see their thoughts as it relates to AI, as it relates to like the the robotics that they're bringing in, what is the biggest fear? Again, is what if these things are like us?
Right.
It's always running at the back of their mind that someone is going to do to them what they've done to others, and I call that cosmic justice. They should be paranoid.
Indeed. No, but you're right though. That is like one of their biggest fears. I mean, they do podcast after podcast, news article, journal article, like what happens if they are like us? And when they say like us, they're talking about themselves, because we're not
even. All we've been trying to do all this time is just live in balance with creation, ma'at. That's all we've been trying. That's all we've been doing.
Yep, that's a fact. That's a fact. But speaking of AI, as such a celebrated artist as yourself, I wanted to ask your opinion of AI in music. We have seen some artists admit to using it to write lyrics. We have it now making beats. And as you know, none of this exists without using data sets of real artists' music. When it comes to AI-driven music, what are your thoughts about it? Because it seems like the powers that be in the industry are really trying to push and make this a thing. But to our credit, most African people are like, nah, I ain't with that.
I have a few different thoughts. The first one being that every technological shift in how music is created and consumed has sparked a level of controversy, and there's been some level of resistance against it by the previous generation. So for me to look at, because I started recording music as a teenager and making, composing music. So I was coming in the age where, Fruity Loops is already a thing. Like, I mean, there's certain things that I entered into music with where some elder might have looked at that and been like, what? Computer?
No, you're right. I remember people were getting on folks for using Fruity Loops, but Ninth Wonder ends up being, one of the greatest producers of all time who uses Fruity Loops.
I'm telling you, even the way the program has evolved now, like it's one of the workstations that a lot of people swear by. I've seen people be very effective with it. But any of the digital things that we use at one time would have been kind of verboten in the eyes of traditionalists. So for one, I don't use it. I do not use any form of AI in the music I create that's based on, again, the way that I view music spiritually. Because the moment you begin looking outward for inspiration, you've already disconnected. You've already lost that connection. And like most muscles, spirit is also a thing where either you use it or you lose it. It's a relationship. If you only call me when you need something, when you're desperate, it's a lot less likely that I'm gonna want to jump into action if we have a day-to-day, kind of link. So that's my advice to anyone who's creating, is to make sure that because they say singers and players of instruments, my springs are in thee, not in the algorithm. So make sure that you are visiting that wellspring daily, and you're caring for it, and you're keeping it clean, you're keeping those channels pure and keeping them open. At the same time, it's a major opportunity, because when you look at the foundations of the music industry, and we can get into the lives of so many of our greats. You mentioned Nina Simone. There's so many of our great ancestors in the music who were absolutely dragged through the mud by the media, by the major labels, by different entities that sought to suppress certain types of messaging, or even certain sounds that they just deemed. I was just looking at something the other day that was saying that even like Thames, for example, apparently had a hard time coming in. People didn't like her voice. People didn't believe in her approach being viable for whatever reason. So we live in an age now where we have the ability to reach out directly through various platforms and show our personalities and show our abilities. And, you know, we don't necessarily need those infrastructures to the same extent. At the same time, there's that same concern that, you know, that I put forward, which is every time we press upload, there is, you know, a cloud consciousness that is studying and incorporating whatever we put into these spaces. So there's a level of sovereignty that I see people reclaiming as well. For example, I have a release lined up for this year that is actually very political in nature. It's called Babylon Bomb. Coming out strictly, initially, we're going to make sure it goes out strictly on vinyl. We don't even want to put it into the digital space. So there is a resurgence of these things. There is a resurgence of more intimate performances, even by artists who might not be Live Nation level or be, you know, touring on the grand scale. I think the unintended consequence of a more synthetic approach to music is that people are craving that which is authentic and, you know, real vocalists and people who can actually perform. We're going to be valued in a way that I think even pre-COVID, maybe people didn't realize fully what they had. So I feel that since that time, there's a different type of reverence that people have for the tradition or the spiritual ceremony that music really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that your music encapsulates. And that's what the apprehension of a lot of fans is like they don't want music to lose its soul, our music, you know what I mean? To lose its soul. And I think a lot of people feel like too much AI that may happen. But you make a great point that even in the age of AI, people are going back to buying vinyls, CDs, cassettes. You know, there's something, I don't know, man. It's like, cause I've started back maybe about 3 or 4 years ago, and I don't know, man. Sometimes it just feels better to play a physical, you know what I'm saying, record or cassette or CD than just listening to it on our phone. I think sometimes when things come a little bit too easy, we don't necessarily appreciate it the way we should. So if our favorite artist drops an album, as you know, most times albums that come out on Friday. By the time, let's say drops at 12, people have already written up think pieces about if the album is good or not at 1 in the morning, right? They're not giving it time to sit with it. And when you have the physical, you ride with it in your car, play it when you're cleaning up, and you begin to sit with it and build that relationship. And you hear things that you didn't hear on the first listen or the second listen. And that brings me to my next question. When we look at reggae music, hip hop, R&B, a lot of times people today will complain that the quality is not what it once was. Also, the way we get music is a lot different, right? But when you hear people say that in 2026, especially from a reggae music perspective, what are your thoughts on that?
My first question that usually tells me everything I need to know is who you're listening to. When's the last time you've actually done some research and done some crate digging? Because something that you touched on was very, the eye is very, very on point for going that route, because the way that we even consume music being so low effort changes the level of investment that we have emotionally in what we're consuming. So I used to work at a record shop when I was in high school. I used to leave school and every day I'm looking to see like, what is Green Sleeves or VP, like is the new rhythm juggling, like, what's coming. And then when you get a rhythm, back in the days, you would have a rhythm. So for those who don't understand what rhythm culture is, the tradition in Jamaica, which is also one of our connections to hip hop, is that, you know, you would have sound systems that might have an instrumental, and, you know, there are all these artists in the building. So different people jump on the sound system and everybody would sing on that same beat. And the way that the producers would scout artists is in the parties. In the South, the original A&R was the party itself.
Yeah.
The party responds to a record, and it's like the next day, yo, youth, where you do? What?
Right.
Tomorrow? Yo, at 1 o'clock tomorrow, my forward, my circle feel, we're going to the studio. And then sometimes they would record this song that day, and it's on the radio by that night. It's pressed, the vinyl is pressed, gone to radio.
Right,
From the dance the night before. So having to physically, and it's on both sides. So a lot of artists nowadays have never been through that school. I went to the sound system school. You know, I started performing with bands and jumping on sound systems as a teenager and having to learn how to interact with crowds and, you know, hone my craft and how I deal with my breath control, my vocals, all these things. Some artists are millionaires and are signed and are all these things before they've ever had to get in front of a real crowd. It's just from their efforts, just from being in their bedroom. So that's one disconnect. The other disconnect is a lot of the schools well, first of all, in Boston, I'm gonna tell you this right now, they're doing everything they can to eliminate public schools altogether. And and
going to like some charter schools.
Yeah, a lot of that. It's a lot of that. And even in the schools that do exist, the music programs are one of the things they don't want to fund. So a lot of people are not actual musicians. They don't play instruments. They've never been around real instruments. So that definitely affects the quality of the music. And then the fact that people don't have to get up off their behind. So like I said, like we're saying, go to the record store and like go through and see what they want to pick. All right, I've selected this. I've spent $13.99. I'm gonna get my money's worth. I want to hear. I want to hear everything on this. You know, so that definitely changes things. But I think this is an amazing era. If you listen to the quality of some of the artists of today across genres, I think we're in a really, really great time. The ones who are really shining and standing out amongst the pack, because there are so many artists, are absolutely exceptional. The issue is that, again, the platforms and the algorithm, a lot of times, you know, we live in an eyeball economy, and most people are drawn to that which is familiar already. So it can be an uphill battle. And then a lot of the platforms that control who get seen by the wider masses, we all know how that goes. It's pay to play. So
a lot of it is pay to play. A lot of it is pay to play. Yeah, like you pay to get in that algorithm. I mean, we kind of saw a lot of those accusations being made during the Kendrick and Drake battle, and then it started coming out. You know, it's a lot of ways that people get in that algorithm. I'm not
right, and unfortunately, a lot of times, again, because it's eyeball based, they go for the lowest common denominator, which is what attracts the lust of the flesh, what attracts whatever, you know, somebody throwing bands and looking like they live in a lifestyle that they want to live. You know, that's kind of what is being pushed. But it's really not that different from, you know, you look at the 90s and when they brought in more of the gangster rap versus, you know, the origins of hip hop, which was obviously a lot more conscious. So it looks like a kind of a repetition of the same cycle. And then what tends to happen as well, I'm going to say this, once the music has lost its soul, the carcass of it is taken over by the same system that eviscerated it. So you see a lot of the prominent reggae acts of this time are no longer even Black or Caribbean.
Wow.
There's a lot of white American reggae.
I saw I didn't know who the group was, but I've seen a couple quote unquote white reggae groups like win Grammy Awards and win these big awards, and I'm like, yo, you couldn't find, y'all not really tapped in like that. And I think like that makes me think though, like with artists such as yourself, Chronics, Kabaka Pyramid, Jesse Royal, Protege, Janan, there's been a resurgence in roots reggae, right? And you're definitely a part of that resurgence. I guess when it comes to roots reggae in 2026, how do you feel about its health? Meaning, like, is it in a good space right now? Because me personally, those artists that I mentioned, including yourself, they represent like a new tradition that's pulling from the older tradition, right? Like it's the same thing, but y'all are keeping it going. Or y'all are keeping it going. But I see a lot of flack sometimes being directed at dance hall because from some critics they say the content of dance hall music has gotten a little too violent or things of that nature. So when we think about dance hall and roots, I don't mean to separate the two because I don't like necessarily deal in separation, but we're just doing it for the sake of this conversation. Where do you see roots and where do you see dance hall at the moment?
I think there are a couple of things going on there. One of them being the sanitization of the real history of reggae music. Recently, I did a lecture at a university in Vermont, St. Michael's College, and the lecture was called Born in Jamaica, Rastafari, Rhythm and Resistance. And what was highlighted in the lecture is the reality that from its inception until now, roots reggae music has never really been a beloved product of Jamaica. It's been viewed with suspicion. It's been viewed by, the society as subversive to the values of what we call the bigger heads, or like the elites of Jamaica would like to see. So we all look in hindsight, everybody reveres Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, all of these artists who in their time were absolutely reviled, were harassed by the police, were beaten, imprisoned. He's saying that they've sanitized Fela Kuti's image. There are so many people that we revere now that we have to look at it. We have to look at reality. We have to really take history into account and know that even though it's conscious music, it was just as frowned upon by the society in its time as dancehall is now. And the thing about dancehall, has it become more extreme to a certain extent? Yes, but not so much, because I think dancehall has always been a place where it's about expression. And what people were expressing in the 90s when I was growing up was reflective of what was going on in the society then. But now we also have to think about the reality that we are in the smartphone era. So there's certain things, like certain kind of acts or activities that are being talked about in the music now that I feel like people now having these cell phones and being able to view certain explicit acts more easily. And it's an escalation. But violence in dancehall is like, we can go away, to the beginning of culture. And it's like, it's always been kind of a bust your head culture. There's always been that bad man, gunman element to dancehall. And when Peter Tosh said, I'm coming in hot, 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 firing some shot, shot, shot. I mean, like you said, the line is very thin. So although dancehall is in a state right now where internationally it's not particularly popular, I would say mainly because the sound has shifted away from the more Jamaican sounding rhythms to what they call now trap hall. There's more of a trap sound, American influence sound. But again, with reggae music, a lot of those early bands, even if you go before reggae music into the ska and the mento, they were heavily influenced by blues, by what was going on in New Orleans at the times, and the harmony groups. Just like you had the Stylistics and the Temptations, you had John Holt and the Paragons, and you had the Heptones, and you had there's a parallel there that I think we need to pay attention to. But in the modern era, we also have to look at the economics of music and how certain things, like, you don't really see a lot of groups anymore, period. Why don't you see groups? We live in an age, like I said, based on the devices I'm looking forward to the period where we are going to see real longitudinal studies on the impact of, mobile phones or smartphones on the overall psychology of human beings and the trajectory of our development as a species. But everyone is now the star of their own show. Everyone is a brand. Everyone wants to be marketed in that way. And it's like, Bobby Brown grew up a few minutes away from where I grew up, right down the street here in Boston. And you think of New Edition, and you think of, it's not like it was easy back then. I was watching their story the other day. They have that show, outlines their story, and it's not like it was easy. It's ever been easy to keep groups together, but people did it. People managed to do it, and it's like the way that technology has also come in and created that partitioning of people, even in the creative process. It's definitely changed some ways that, like, you think of Motown and the assembly line, having a Smokey Robinson writing, and Marvin Gaye is a session musician. He's over there drumming for Stevie Wonder. Like, you have to think about the lineage of these things. And I will say that to this day, in Jamaica, there are certain artists that do a really great job of having the youths come around them and rally around them. My personal mentor is Barry Salmond. He's really taken me under his wing, and there have been other elders who have seen what I'm doing, King Jammies, of course, and people who have seen what I'm doing and chosen to say, youth, go on with that thing, man, forward, let's they push you through a certain level of schooling. And I think that is less than it was back in the day. And another thing that has to be touched on, I know this might be a long answer, but
no, it's all right.
It goes full circle, where the breakdown of the spiritual institutions. Because whatever you want to say about the church, my first introduction to live musicians and like vocals and certain things was in these spaces with a bunch of Black people gathered together singing for the Almighty.
Right. And
because the Almighty has been taken out of the center, like even when you listen to Ella Andal of Trinidad, who's one of the most famous, Orisha chanters, Yoruba chanters, is like, there's a quality in the vocal it's not about talent. It's not just the talent or the technical ability of what she's doing. There is a frequency that is present when people are singing for the Almighty that cannot be duplicated. There's no AI that can replicate that. So I guess I'll leave it there.
No, powerful answer, because I remember seeing I went down a rabbit hole of watching interviews of D'Angelo whenever he returned to the Essence, and he spoke of the same thing about, growing up singing in the church. And I think one of the aspects of that people don't understand, there's a lot of musical education that happens whenever you're singing in the church. I mean, learning even certain technical aspects of music. And then the also what you mentioned, the spiritual aspect of it as well. And I think that's definitely missing in a lot of just Black music, period, right now. And it may not be that the fact that it's missing in Black music, it may be more of the algorithm not pushing those type of artists on us the way they push the sanitized, more pop artists. You know what I mean? And I think that's more what it is. And I think that's a lesson for all of those who say that, Black music is dying. You're just not looking in the right places. You're allowing the algorithm to dictate to you what's hot instead of doing what we've always done. We dictate what's hot. You know what I'm saying? I even read, I was reading a book and it talked about how algorithms in these days and times are not simply just algorithms, they're agents. They're in a certain direction. All right, we are back. Thank you for staying with us. We had some technical difficulties, but I'm here with the great MediSun, who is an extremely talented artist, extremely intelligent brother who we can learn from politically and musically and spiritually. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this interview thus far. But I wanted to close out by asking you this. As an artist, how would you like to be remembered? And what would you want your legacy to be when people think of your name?
You know, I mentioned one of my mentors in music, Barry Salmon. I remember the first time I had the opportunity to really be around him and have a one-to-one reasoning. And for those who don't know who Barry Salmon is, I believe he's had over 50 #1 records in Jamaica. He's had a lot of really big songs, long career since his first #1 was in 1976. He's still out here doing music to this day. And I asked him, like, what's your approach to songwriting? And he just looked over at me and said, tell the truth. And that was an affirmation of what I have been doing thus far, and even, and you know, a call to action to be even more radical in how I go about crafting these songs, because every song is a time capsule. You know, there's certain songs that I've created where it's like almost embarrassing in hindsight, and I don't even like too much hearing them, but it's like at the same time, this was where my consciousness was at a moment in time.
Yeah.
So, you know, even when I advise some of my peers or other artists that, you know, ask me to advise them same way on what they're doing, my first question to them is, when you have a child, or if you have children, how would you feel about them approaching you and saying, you know, Dad or Mom, why do you say this? So legacy is extremely, extremely important, and it's not just about music. There's a certain song I have named Speak Love, where it says, you know, that even your words in day-to-day conversation, you know, words can be lethal weapons, and a statement is a lifetime sentence. So, you know, when you look into even like quantum mechanics and like the butterfly effect, every little action or inaction does have, you know, very wide-ranging consequences. So in all that we do, even, you know, thinking about our spiritual practices, and, you know, I mentioned that even Toussaint eventually became sort of deified based upon his actions. A lot of the ones that we look to as deities, you know, the magazine, as mentioned, is Iansá. You know, I identify closely with Ogun, so Iansá would actually be like my balance, you know, within that realm. But it's like Ogun was a real human being that lived a certain way and is remembered. Shango, you can call all of these names, that these people walk the earth and they live their life in such a powerful way. It's not that they were perfect; they still had their flaws, or their I guess foibles, so to speak. But they were found worthy based upon the level of sacrifice that they put forward for the nation. And when you look at His Imperial Majesty, same way, you know, what has made him an icon isn't about what he amassed for himself. It's about the sacrifice. So I look at my journey, and I'm really grateful for what I've achieved so far, and some of the really cool things I've managed to do. At the same time, the most important thing is, through my walk, what is it? Because we know that if our ancestors have done it, it can be done.
Absolutely.
So what is it that my walk is going to inspire next you to do? And not to, you know, I want to wrap this up, but when I was really young, I actually had epilepsy. Up until the age of about 12, I was managing that neurological condition. I was, you know, medicated for it. And I remember living with that fear. And then this was a time that in our community, it wasn't a case where they're going to send a counselor or somebody to come talk to you about how you feel about being 6 years old with a condition that you don't really understand, but you know that if you don't take these pills, something really bad can happen to you. You could potentially lose your life. Dealing with my mortality at that age was rough, but there are certain voices I could listen to and messages I would listen to, you know, Garnet Silk and Sizzla Kalonji and even Busta Rhymes and, you know, Public Enemy and certain people that were sending messages, A Tribe Called Quest, that were sending messages that were so powerful and gave me such a sense of self that my community around me couldn't necessarily provide. I believe that music kept me alive. My spirit, on a spiritual level, kept my soul alive. And all I ever wanted to do ever since that point is that when I have the microphone in my hand, I'm going to hand that to a next youth, because there's a young person somewhere, maybe even an elder, could be someone older than me, that is in a difficult space, and if I can be a light to show them themselves and liberate minds, then that is the greatest legacy that one can leave.
Absolutely, absolutely. I wanted just to again to thank you for, you know, taking the time to sit with us in this interview, but also thank you for everything that you do, the art that you make, the science that you teach. You know what I'm saying? We're in a period in time where those things are extremely important, and they help to, you know, keep us inspired, keep our focus on the struggle, keep our focus on, you know, our own personal well-being as well. And so, again, you know, we appreciate you, and keep shining, good brother.
Give thanks for the giving of thanks. Respect.